Hey guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we have a fun subject, at least it's fun for me. We're gonna talk about who takes care of orchids in nature, in their natural habitat. It is actually pretty fascinating to think about it because if you really go into the details, you will see that many things that we do with our orchids, we simply do them to imitate nature, although of course in a different way. Nature has its tools, we only have our two little hands, and we have different ways of reaching the same goal. So today I'm going to mention some things that we do which can actually correlate with nature. But first of all, I'm going to start with mentioning the only thing we try to avoid in regards to nature. We don't actually try to copy everything because we would not like it. Now, the number one thing that happens in nature and that we try to avoid so much is natural selection. We're human, we have empathy. It is within our nature to nurture something, to make it flourish, to take care of it practically and make sure no harm comes its way. Well, nature doesn't really work with these principles. In order for it to develop the best individuals out there, it needs to select the very best out of them. If we think that orchids can actually produce thousands, if not millions of seeds within a seed pod and think about how many flowers orchids actually produce, well, if all of those seeds would get a chance to germinate and grow, the world will be overrun by orchids, which, for us is not such a bad thought, but for nature it actually is. It needs to maintain a balance. So just like with everything, nature has its way to maintain the populations in proper numbers. And with orchids, the number of individuals that actually make it and survive and flourish is so incredibly small compared to the amount that is produced. Out of those millions of seeds, maybe one, maybe two, maybe none will actually sprout. The seeds need to be carried by the wind into an appropriate place. If they land in water, they will not develop. If they land on the soil and they belong to an epiphytic orchid, again, they will not develop. If the place on the tree on which they landed doesn't have sufficient light, the seedling will not develop. If there aren't any mycorrhiza in that location, the seed will not germinate. If that season is a little bit more rainy than usual and all of the seeds will just be flushed from the trees, none of them will survive, and so on and so forth. There are so many factors in nature that dictate how many seeds will actually sprout that the statistics is really against the orchids. And not only that, let's say they do sprout, they do have the luck to land in a proper location, the season is good, is mild, there are always genetic anomalies, even in nature. All of the seedlings that cannot overcome disease on their own, they will perish. There's a degree of luck in that as well. Some seedlings might actually be eaten off, let's say, by snails. There's nothing you can do against snails as an orchid. Some of these orchids will be trialed a lot in nature, and only those who are fit and who are lucky, let's call it like that, will become mature. Out of millions and millions of seeds, only a few orchids actually make it to maturity, and in the process, only the strongest and fittest ones remain. This is nature's way of making sure that not the individual, but the entire species has a future. Natural selection is normal, but we as humans have some issues with it, because again, we have empathy, we want everybody to be okay. So in our growing spaces, there's no such thing as natural selection. We don't want to choose the fittest individual to withstand the perils of our living room. Although, well, that can be a thing. And moreover, the vast majority of the orchids we grow, well, they're man-made hybrids. Not all of them are species. And even if they are species, they're still cultivated and obtained by us. In the process, they might have very well lost a lot of their survival genes. Through hybridization, we obtained beautiful flowers, amazing fragrances and colors and patterns, but we lost some survival genes. If we put an intergeneric in nature, we wouldn't even know where to put it because it is a hybrid of multiple genera, and these genera can come from different places on Earth. So wherever we will put it in nature, there is a very high chance it will just die off within a few weeks because it simply lacks the genes that nature selected for it. But as I was saying, we are obtaining hybrids and orchids for enjoyment in our living rooms, not in nature, and our living room plays by totally different rules. So now let's start with the things that we actually do ourselves in different ways than nature that actually try to obtain the same outcome. First off, you know rule number 1 with Phalaenopsis orchids: never leave water in the crown of the orchid or in between the leaves, as it can lead to rotting. Along the years I had quite a few comments pointing out that in nature it rains a lot, so this rule makes no sense. However though, in nature, Phalaenopsis orchids do not grow like this, upright. They actually grow on their side. So whatever water tries to pull in the crown or in between the leaves simply falls off. But not only the shape and the way an orchid grows in nature affects pulling of water, there's also wind. Nature is not this enclosed room like our living room. In nature, there can be a constant breeze and constant fresh air. So for orchids which do grow upright, water pulling in the crowns or new growth might not be an issue because it's just so breezy and so ventilated that water simply evaporates, which we cannot really say about our living rooms. Yes, we can install fans, but there are certain moments where fans are really not comfortable. Therefore, to minimize the risk of rotting, we just avoid the crown area, or if we do get water in the crown and leaf joints, we simply remove it with a paper towel. So we're merely compensating for the fact that we don't grow our orchids like nature grows them. Speaking about potting orchids, why do we pot them? In nature, they don't grow like this. As I was saying, they grow on their side. Can't we just mount them on something and make them grow on the side? Of course we can, and many people actually do it. There is a problem though that again has to do with our living room. It needs more water than if it would be potted, because the role of the pot and of the medium is to hold in moisture for the orchid. And of course to display it in a living room, but more important is the water aspect. You see, in nature it rains pretty often. In our living room it doesn't rain. We have to deliver the water. So either we deliver water 2 times a day or every day, either we do so every few days. The outcome is pretty much the same for the orchid, because even if we're not there to deliver water, the medium holds the water and delivers it to the orchid. We pot orchids for display purposes as well, of course, but many of us do have a job, or we have a family or children or pets to take care of. If we only had our orchid as a main focus, then yes, sure, we can grow orchids however we want and water them as frequent as we want. But being that many of us have busy lives, we do pot them simply to make our lives better with them, or actually easier, and keep them hydrated, even though we are not able to water twice a day or once a day at least. So in the end, we pot them because we cannot make it rain multiple times a day or even every day. It's our way to deliver water without actually watering. Next up, removing dried sheets from the orchids. I personally tell you pretty often to remove these sheets because they don't really serve any more purpose. Moreover, they can harbor pests, and even if you treat orchids, you might not get to all of these pests because they hide under the sheets. So what do orchids do in nature? Surely these sheets have a purpose. Well, the truth is, they used to have a purpose. They were green and they protected the pseudobulb as it was forming. Now that they're dried, their role is not as important anymore, so nature disposes of them through natural processes. One of them is decomposition. The older the sheath is, the easier it is to remove because it starts to break down, and in the end, even wind can make them disappear. But since in our living rooms we don't have wind, we might have a fan, but not necessarily, we remove them by hand. Another way in which nature removes them is with rain. If you go to the sink and you wet one of these dried sheets, you will notice it becomes a little bit more slippery and a little bit easier to remove. If you ever have issues with these not being able to come off properly from the orchid, if you wet the stem or the pseudobulb, you will see they peel off a lot faster. Removal of the sheaths is not something super important. If you don't really have reasons and pest infestations, you don't necessarily need to remove them. I personally do so because of the pest issue. Sometimes I do have outbreaks because I have all of my windows open. The main reason though is aesthetics for me. Orchids just look better without the dried sheaths. However though, nature has its way of removing them as well. Next up, removing sap. This is something I don't particularly do all the time, but sometimes it is necessary because this sap can actually lead to some fungal formation and spots on the leaves, and sometimes the sap can be so excessive that it can actually damage the bud. So from time to time I do remove this excessive sap, which is nothing more than sugars. How does nature deal with it? Simple, rain. Because it rains and this is sugar, the sap simply melts away. And being that it rains more often in nature than in our living room, obviously the sap doesn't get to build up all that much in nature. There is another thing with some orchids, such as the Schomburgkias, sap might actually be produced to attract certain ants. Some orchids go to great lengths to attract ants, which in return protect them. Mind you, not all species of ants will protect orchids, so let's not generalize, but in certain parts of the world, orchids are actually trying to attract ants, which in return protect them from pests. We remove it in the place of the ants and rain. Another thing we often do in cultivation, and you've heard me talk about it a lot, is removal of the dead roots. Of course, in nature, nobody removes the dead roots, but also in nature, nobody puts orchids in pots. A pot is a very contained ecosystem. It's hard to maintain an equilibrium in such a small container. In nature, many of these orchids are not confined because they're epiphytic. They grow on trees and branches. So even if they do experience dead roots, there comes the rain and starts to remove the decomposing and decaying roots. Because yes, after a while the roots will start to decompose. In pots, there's a very high chance that all of that debris remains there. It doesn't really get washed away, especially not at the rate that it happens in nature. So for this reason, we cut them simply because we want to avoid complications, again, because of the way we grow orchids and because we cannot provide that rain all the time. Keeping dead roots and having bio buildup in pots does not lead to anything good. One more thing we do in cultivation, maybe more for aesthetical reasons, is we are cleaning the leaves with lemon juice sometimes. Well, nature doesn't really have lemon juice to splash on the leaves. Why do we use that? Simple. Again, in cultivation, there's no rain to always clean the leaves. But more than that, in cultivation, mainly in nurseries, they use a lot of fungicides and a lot of products that are intended to maintain orchids alive and not go through that natural selection process. These fungicides and substances can deposit on the leaves. Not only salts from fertilizers can be deposited on the leaves, and the best way to remove hardened salts is with an acid. Lemon juice is an acid. Some people use white vinegar as well. So these things remove that salt buildup better than plain water. I actually have a video about it, check it down below. And yes, of course, in nature, nobody puts lemon juice on orchid leaves. But also in nature, nobody puts fungicides and pesticides and all of these things we use in order to maintain our orchids alive. Speaking about salt deposits and fertilizers, who fertilizes orchids in nature? Easy. Nature fertilizes them through decomposition, organic tissue such as dried leaves or twigs or animal or bird poops, and all of these organic things that decompose, they break down and in the end result in certain nutrients. Not only that, in nature through wind we can get sand particles or mineral particles such as calcium, which again serve as nutrition for orchids. So with every rain, the orchid benefits from all of these things being flushed on its roots. But of course, in nature there are many chemical processes happening which we cannot recreate in our homes, such as decomposition. There's a microclimate there that includes microbes, bacteria, microorganisms even, that help decompose this debris. In our living rooms, it doesn't happen. So we need to acquire fertilizers. And I'm not gonna go into the details of what type of fertilizer everyone uses, but bottom line is a fertilizer delivers all of those nutrients that orchids normally and naturally find in nature without having to have our birds poop on the roots, because that would actually burn. Don't try it. And of course, when we talk about fertilization, we talk about flushing our orchid pots. And I do have a video I recently made. If you want to see how I like to flush my orchids and why, check the video down below in the description. But basically, we are actually trying to copy nature. As I was saying, it rains, it flushes, it cleans everything, including orchid roots. There's no salt buildup or biological buildup in nature due to the flushing effect of rain. Does it rain in the living room? No. Therefore, it is actually beneficial for most of us to flush our pots from time to time. In this way, we are eliminating salt buildup, fertilizer buildup, or biological debris buildup. How about this one? Why do we need to repot our orchids periodically if in nature they are not disturbed? Well, simple. In nature, orchids are growing on actual living things. And yes, the bark on the tree is not necessarily a living material, but each tree maintains its bark in good shape through some processes. Therefore, the bark on the tree doesn't break down as fast as the bark we're using with our orchids because it is still connected to the tree. Therefore, it will not start to leach out or acidify the environment around the root system, whereas the bark we use, being dead, it does start to do that and it starts to affect the roots. Also, in cultivation, we use things that normally orchids don't find in nature, such as coconut husk. Orchids don't grow on coconuts. The coconut is a fruit. It's very short-lived, if you want, until it falls from the tree. So no orchid actually grows on coconut husk. We use it after we prepare it because it works as a water-retentive medium. And speaking about this, there's another question that sometimes pops in my comment section. Why do I want to use clay materials or inorganic materials? They're just so unnatural. Well, it depends what you understand by natural. As I was saying, coconut husk is really unnatural for orchids as well. It's just as unnatural as clay. But with clay and inorganic media, all we're trying to do is to imitate that effect that the bark has, which is not to decompose, not to break down. Practically, we are actually avoiding disturbing the orchids by repotting way too often. So even if it's not a organic, let's not say natural, an organic material such as the bark, it does have the same effect as the live bark in the sense that it does not break down. What about the light? Why do many of us supplement with artificial light? Well, it's pretty obvious. Not all the corners of our living room are well lit, but not only that, many of us live in environments or actually geographical location in which these orchids are not found. These orchids usually grow more towards the equator. Now, there is a difference in day length. Towards the equator, the differences between day and night are a lot less obvious than further north or further south. Therefore, our day length might be a lot smaller in winter than it is in their natural habitat. So we're practically trying to improvise the sun because we cannot make the sun stay longer in the sky. So we use artificial light to provide a few more hours of light to our orchids, just like they would receive in nature. And speaking about imitating nature with technology, why do we use fans and air conditioners? Again, simple, because we are trying to imitate the natural conditions of these orchids. Where they're growing, temperature doesn't go above 28 degrees Celsius, let's say. In my area, it goes to 45. Of course, the altitude plays a role here as well. So I need to use technology to control temperature. Also fans, we're using them because in our growing spaces there isn't any wind, so we're trying to provide it. Opening the windows and letting in fresh air tries to imitate the constant fresh air that these orchids receive in nature. So with all of this hardware we're using, we are actually trying to imitate nature, not give them something they don't naturally encounter. And speaking about trying to imitate nature, in some places around the world it barely rains, such as in my location. So I cannot use natural rainwater with orchids. I also cannot use tap water because it's way too hard for what they have been used to all of these millions of years. So the solution is filtered water, osmosis water. Many of us have a sort of filtration system which filters water for our orchids. Again, we're just trying to imitate rain here because we don't have enough rain to collect it. And the list can actually go on. There are many additives that many people use in the hopes that they will obtain the same microbial climate as in nature, such as probiotics. Many people try to use mycorrhizae. I tried an experiment, I didn't see any results, but I did try it. All of these in the hopes that we can recreate nature a little better. But of course, there are many things that we cannot do like nature. We cannot make it rain, we cannot make it wind, we cannot make it sun, we cannot make it fresh air. We need to use whatever our humanity created in order to recreate what nature created. And as I was saying in the beginning, the number one thing we're trying to do is avoid natural selection. So yes, orchids do perish in nature. Only the strongest and the fittest survive. But do we care about the strongest and fittest? No, we love everybody and we want everybody to survive. Therefore, we're using insecticides, fungicides sometimes, additives, whatever we have at our disposal in order to maintain them alive because that is our human nature. Many of the times the orchids we are working with are man-made hybrids, and they don't actually act like they would normally act in nature. Remember when I had that Sederia which produced a lot of keikis? Even though she's not a hybrid, she is actually a man-obtained individual. It was created in a nursery, not pulled from the nature. So being that she didn't go through natural selection, her genes are not the fittest. Do I care about that? No, I don't, because she's not in nature, she's in my living room. Therefore, I will assist it in its little genetical anomalies. There are many things that we do with our orchids because our orchids are man-made hybrids or faulty, let's call them like that in that regard, but we don't care because we are not Mother Nature, we're not as perfect as Mother Nature, and we don't operate with the same rules. And that is why we do what we do with our orchids. To avoid natural selection, mainly. Other than that, is just trying to imitate the stuff that we can imitate from nature. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's really fascinating to think about things in this manner and to see what exactly we do in order to copy nature and what we don't do, because there are two distinct things we want. So I hope this answered some questions. If some of you had questions related to why we do what we do with orchids, and you know the drill, like or dislike this video below, subscribe for more orchid videos like this, tutorials, Q&As, and other fun subjects, and turn on notifications if you want YouTube to notify you whenever I upload a new video. Also, if you expand the description, you'll see all of the products that I use on a regular basis in my grow room, if you were ever curious about that. And with that said, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye!